Hey guys, I want to introduce to you all my friend Jacob, and he is a long-term missionary. He's been working in unreached people groups now for how many years, Jacob?
7.
7 years. And so I want you to hear his story, and then on another video, I'm actually going to get to ask him questions about missions and missiology. But on this interview, we're going to get to hear his story of how he got into missions and what did daily life look like as a missionary, and some of the challenges, some of the obstacles, the opportunities. So Jacob, let's start kind of from the beginning a little bit, like growing up before you went away to missions. Give me kind of the soundbite, not like your whole testimony, but like did you grow up in church? Did you know about missions? Talk to me a little bit about church life and what you even knew about missions before you knew you were supposed to go.
Yeah, so I grew up in Assemblies of God Church. Assemblies of God was founded on missions. The purpose of the denomination is to see the greatest evangelism the world has ever seen. And so my pastor really believed in that, and he loved having missionaries at the church. So I grew up seeing missionaries in church, and I loved reading books about missionaries as a little kid. David Livingston, Billy Sunday, things like that. In children's church, we'd hear stories about missionaries, and I was so fascinated by that stuff. So even from an early age, I was really interested in missions, which is unlike a lot of people that I know, most people I know, to be honest. So God really has been stirring this in my heart since I was a kid. And my grandpa was an Assemblies of God pastor. He and my grandma had considered doing missions before they church planted in America. So it's a lifelong foundation of missions for me.
Okay, you're like the quintessential cover story of like an AG.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
I'm the poster boy for AG missions.
You just made that really clear. Well, I love that. I mean, I think I wish that regardless of AG, like I wish that every church had that kind of missions DNA. I grew up in a Wesleyan church, and missions was a part of our church.
Cool.
Now, not in as much of a strategic way, but just in a like, missions is what we do. It's what we're about. And so we were always involved in missions trips. And I think that did have a lot to do growing up where it just felt like, hey, this is a part of our faith. And it always felt like an opportunity. And then I've realized now later, we'll probably talk about it either in this video or the next, more in like, where are we and strategy around missions? Because that's a shift even. And I'm sure even you would be aware of that in church settings, even in AG. Like, not every church is aware. Churches love missions. Some do.
Yeah.
But even if they love missions, they may not know where we are in missions. But right. Okay. So where was the moment then where you felt the invitation? You said yes.
So I'm a little different from most people, where I kind of had this feeling that I was going to be doing this since I was a kid. But I was thinking, I'll become a youth pastor, and then I'll pastor a church, and then I'll go on the mission field, like that kind of thing. Okay. But when I was 16 years old, I was invited to go to India for a couple of weeks. And when I went to India, I stayed in an orphanage for 2 weeks and went to these villages, these people who were, unreached. They had very few resources, and there were pastors in these churches that took us around, and I got to see what it was like, not only to be a missionary, because there were a couple of missionaries there, but also for the pastors on the ground who are trying to reach their own people for Christ. And I went home with this definite idea that I'm going to be doing this for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
Because, there's so few people doing this. There's so few people going to those unreached places. So, to me, Matthew 28:19 and 20, when Jesus said, "Go and make disciples," that's not a request of his people. That's a command. And so if you're not doing it, you need to be doing it.
Yeah. I think it's, well, we'll get into that. That's good. So 16, you went, which I think is super cool that you went to India. I've recognized there's just not enough opportunities for people to go to that side of the world.
Yeah, it's expensive. I raised money to go, and I was alone. It was just me and the guy who invited me, and then a couple of other missionaries who were there.
Yeah.
So other people pretty much paid my way. So we weren't trying to raise tens of thousands of dollars for a whole group to go. We were just a couple of people raising a few $1,000s to get us over there. And, our accommodations, you don't usually send a team and say, hey, you're staying in an orphanage. People hope and expect for kind of better accommodations, which isn't great to have that mindset, but it's just the reality of the situation a lot of times.
Yeah.
Or if they're going somewhere like on the Western Hemisphere, it's just cheap. Everything's cheaper.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that makes sense. There's definitely the barrier to entry, both in travel and cost, is a lot less expensive.
Yeah.
In Central America, Latin America, and yet the exposure to what real pioneer missions is going to be absent.
Right. And if you're talking about the 1040 window, which is where the majority of the unreached people are, or a lot of those countries like India isn't entirely in the 1040 window, but the entire country is limited access. So you have to go in as a tourist, and you have to pretend like you're, going there just to travel around and see stuff, even if you are going to do ministry. So, it's one of those things that's just harder to get there in any way you can conceive.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, so then you knew you're supposed to go. Describe some of the process, man. Like what it between feeling the call to go and then getting to the field long term. What were some of the steps that took place, the timeline too?
Yeah, so over the next couple of years, I got really heavily involved in ministry in my church. We have something in the Assemblies of God called Fine Arts, where they develop and deploy the gifts of young people, including preaching, acting, singing, music, all pretty much anything you can imagine as a gift that you can use in the church. They develop that. And so I was a part of that in my church, and I got really heavily involved in it. And when I was graduating high school, I wanted to stay involved in that and get kind of on a track to be in full-time ministry. And so I ended up going to a small ministry school that was entirely devoted to using the arts in the church and raising up leaders in the church who were creative in ministry. Mm-hmm. And I got to do hands-on ministry while at the same time learning what it meant to be a disciple and a discipler, which we'll talk about a lot of that later. But that was a huge part of that ministry, was discipleship and the discipleship process. So I got my degree in creative ministry and leadership. I read all kinds of books on discipleship. We talked about it all the time. And as I was doing that, I was looking at what the Assemblies of God has available. I got really interested in Live Dead, which you've had a few people on your podcast involved in Live Dead. And so I just kind of started looking at what can I do now to get involved in missions, and then where can I go in the future? So I prepared myself for ministry. I did ministry, and then I started leading prayer for the persecuted church. There's a ministry online called Voice of the Martyrs. You can look them up and see all these people who are in chains for Jesus. Remember them. The Bible says, remember them as if we are together with them in prison. And so I started leading that ministry. I read all the Live Dead books. I did the Live Dead devotionals and journals and all that kind of stuff. And then my last year, as I was graduating, I was really I knew I was going. I went to Ghana for a month. My last year there, did an internship with a friend of mine who was from the school, who was a youth pastor over there. And I was just praying about, God, where do you want me to go? What do you want me to do? So I actually applied to go the Live Dead route. I was thinking I was going to go to Egypt and learn Arabic and do all that kind of stuff to work with Muslims. Yeah. But God spoke to me while I was praying about, where do you want me to go? and he said, I'm going to open a door and you're going to take it. And I met a missionary with the Assemblies of God who was in Laos, and we became friends. He talked with me. He just invested in my life. And Laos is a little country in Southeast Asia. They're Buddhist. I'd never heard of it. I pray for persecuted Christians. I look at the map. I do Joshua Project, which is about unreached people, all this stuff. And I didn't even know what Lao was, which technically is pronounced Lao, not Laos, but people don't recognize that. But so I was friends with him, and after several months, he says, hey, man, I've been talking to our director, and you've got an open door in Laos if you ever want to come here.
Yeah.
And so I was like, open door, that's the word that God said to me when I was praying about it. So I canceled my Live Dead application. I applied to go to Laos with the people that I had a relationship with, and and kind of God directed everything from there. And the Assemblies of God has a full track. If you want to do anything in missions, you can go onto the Wide Open Missions website and put in all your info, and they'll get you hooked up, and there's a whole pipeline for you.
Yeah. No, that's good. So then how long were you there?
So my first time in Laos was 9 months. It was like getting my feet wet. It's in the AG, there's 3 tiers of ministry. In missions, there's MAPS, which are volunteer workers. You're basically going with just enough money to live, and they don't expect you to pay for any of the ministry that happens there. They just expect you to be there and to volunteer with the missionary and say, hey, I'm here to serve. I'll do anything you tell me to do. And the money you've raised is for your plane tickets, your insurance, your food, and your house. Like, that's it.
Right.
And so I was there 9 months, and within a couple of months, I knew I was going back there. I loved the people. The Lao people were amazing. The leader that I was under was awesome. He was one of the most encouraging people I'd ever worked with. And then, so I went back again for 2.5 years as a missionary associate in the Assemblies of God, which is like an intern. There you have some more funds for ministry purposes. And then after 2.5 years there, really a few months in, I started to feel a shift and a call to Thailand, which is right next to Laos. It's a Buddhist country. The languages in Laos and Thailand are very similar. But the reason I went to Thailand was different. I joined a ministry called Change the Map, which is the Assemblies of God initiative to pray for Buddhists.
Okay.
And I was there for 2.5 years during COVID. But I was about half of the ministry that I did was Change the Map, getting people. Now we have an app. So if you're watching this, get on our app, Change the Map, pray for Buddhists.
Now looking, like, I pulled up Joshua Project while you're sharing.
Cool.
Like Laos is there's more believers, 3% of the country, which is little to nothing, right? And for those listening, like over 36% of the United States is considered evangelical, right?
Right.
And then Thailand, and I guess just to be apples to apples, evangelical there is 2.5%. But then looking at Thailand, it's 1%. So they're falling in that category of, like, they're super red, right?
Yeah.
Did you notice a kind of a shift at all? I mean, even with 3% compared to 1%, like, I know there's small local churches in every country to some degree, but like, could you feel a difference even between that shift going from moderate to red?
The difference that I felt was in the villages outside of the main cities. You would have an entire village that was Christian in Laos.
Okay.
I never saw that in Thailand. I never saw anything like it there. You'd have scatterings of Christians in villages. You'd have a village where a percentage of the population was believers, but not an entire village. It was unheard of in Thailand.
Yeah.
So, there's 10 times as many people in Thailand as there are in Laos. There's just a lot more people to reach, and it's so strange because in Laos, it's a communist country, you know, so there's government restrictions, but in the meantime, the you know the I can't remember who said it, but the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, and persecution is a strong uh, uh, I'd say propeller, I guess, a motivator even for believers to spread their faith. And I have a Lao pastor friend. He said they've slowly had the United Nations looking at Lao and cracking down on some of the things, the persecution that was happening. And he said he noticed that the church started spreading slower after the persecution slowed down. And he said he thinks that the persecution was really important to keep the church spreading. I was like, that's insane. And this pastor is saying, he actually said, I wish we'd keep being persecuted because more people would become believers. I couldn't believe it.
I have mixed feelings on it, but it's
me too.
It's such a like, how does persecution play the role? It does impact. It does play the role.
Yeah.
You know, I certainly don't want to go through persecution. And then at the end of the day, like Jesus too is like, hey, if you're going to follow me, you will. So like, if we don't experience any to any degree ever, are we even following Jesus? You know, like, and we're not going to experience anything like what they experience in the States, but like, you know, but man, I don't know.
Yeah. When I was a teenager, I really thought I was going to run headlong into persecution. I was like, I'm going to die for my faith. You know, I write these little things about, you know, dying for the faith. And a lot of missionaries have in the past. But it's just not like that in the world anymore. Our strategies are different, and we'll probably talk about that a little bit later. But I got to these places and to Laos where there's pretty strong persecution, and realized I can do a whole lot more for the kingdom as an American by not dying for my faith than I could just like running to some village in the middle of nowhere and trying to bring the gospel to like 10 people and then getting killed, you know?
I on that note, like I've always been more like, I was attracted to like adventure, exploration, like wanted to go find some new discovery, you know, got into missions, gave my life to Jesus, wanted to risk my life for the gospel, go to villages, and did village work for a really long time. And in Central America, we found villages that had no believers, no established churches. But in learning more about church planting in recent years, I was really, when you look at these like areas that are all red, you know, like I was just looking at this area of Southeast Asia and like Bangladesh. I was like, oh my gosh, like this is like, that's wildly red. You know, and then, so I was just scanning, and I was talking to a friend this morning to show me news clips, you know, of the atrocities in Burma. And I mean, there's so many people that need to hear the gospel in these regions. And initially when I was praying about going back to the field, and right now I feel like God's called me to mobilize here in the States, but I really wanted to like go do the adventurous thing, like go to the villages. And I realized after talking to other missionaries that actually it's better use of our time as missionaries more often than not. I mean, there's always different, you know, it's not cookie cutter, but to start in cities, we're going to stick out less like a sore thumb. People aren't going to be freaked out of like, why is this guy in our village? You know, cities are more accustomed. There's universities, there's people, all the people from the villages go to the cities. Which to trade and commerce, their young people go to the cities to go to school. And then they go back. And so if we can help reach people in a city, the chances of that taking off and growing and becoming movemental and actually reaching villages with locals who are not going to freak people out, but can actually relate is so much more likely. And initially I was like, that makes sense. I was also disappointed because I was like, my dream to like go and open up a village. You know, but at the end of the day, it's not about Alex.
Exactly.
You know? But I don't know. That was a tangent. I apologize.
No. It's a really, that's exactly what I've experienced and what we talk about overseas in AGWM. called the indigenous church principle is we raise up the indigenous church to go to their own people. There are some countries, I have friends who tried to minister in Pakistan and they couldn't go there because white people just can't, they're not allowed, and they're targeted by the groups. And they said it was a lot better to get Pakistani people in another country, train them up in the church at like an international church or a Pakistani congregation, and send them back. And so there's a lot of places like that. Thailand and Laos are exactly like that. You might be able to have the foreigners go to those places like as a tourist and, you know, be there to kind of get an in for the local people, so that they can develop some relationships. But when it comes down to who's going to be spreading the gospel, who's going to be the pastors of the churches in these villages, in these super rural areas, it can't be the foreigner. It's got to be somebody who looks like them, who sounds like them, and not in us versus them way, but in a who are they even willing to listen to way.
We have to. I think that's just kind of when it comes to missions, we always have to be willing to set aside what we want, our biases, our preferences, and say what works and what would work best, and what works best now may not work best in 5 years. And I think one of the biggest shortcomings with missionaries, you correct me if I'm wrong, but sometimes people in the field who've been there doing it, the old school missionaries, they have a really hard time letting go of what did work for what works now with younger generations in their own countries.
Yeah. I've seen this interesting split even in the older generation where there are older people who are the ones who have learned to innovate the most because they see the change. And so us younger guys were going in Thailand, you know, and there's a couple of older people who are the ones who are teaching us, hey, things need to change from the way they used to be. Okay. And then you see those older guys butting heads with other older guys who are like, well, we've always done it this way. So I think one of the advantages for us younger people is that we can come in, if we're humble, we can come in and ask, you know, what's working, and kind of help usher in the change that if they're an older missionary who has those good strategies that are changing and working, and be discipled by them, let them train us, and not me trying to force that idea on the other older guy who doesn't want to change, but just say, I know what it needs to be when I'm the guy in charge. Kind of stay humble and work with what you can while you can. And
I agree. I'm going to say this. I might shift. I may shift my stance on this later, but I think in general, we kind of got to go as younger people and learn from those older, and they might be wrong. More than likely they're right on the majority of everything, where they're wrong. Right. But then there are areas like on this area of change and innovation and strategy, especially with the younger generations, that we may shift and feel that they don't. And after whatever season that is of learning and gleaning from them, you know, there is the opportunity to share and speak into, you know, what could be different. And if they're just not on board, then it's just I think people sometimes, and I'm speaking from my own experience, we like over spiritualize, overthink, and it's just, you know, and either you stay in it with a lot of resentment that you're not able to do what God's put in your heart, and that ends up inevitably creating like division and toxic team dynamic. You know, or you try so hard to change and it creates, you know what I mean? Like, and I think at some point it's like, hey, you invite, you ask, and if they're not on board, like, you just share with them what's on your heart. And if it doesn't resonate, like find a team where it does. Like, don't spend that much time trying to change people and God's put on their heart. You know, you can join another team where God's already doing that more than likely, or they'd be open to it. Because that is a weird dynamic, man, within missions teams. And I think sometimes Brittany and I learned this the hard way. The most effective thing is not to try to change people and what they think. It's actually just to say, hey, this is where we're leaning. We're going to go and join another team where this is what they're doing. And usually people that, like, if they're not willing to change, when they see enough people leaving to go over there and they see it working there, they will. But trying to change them when they don't want to, and you don't actually have the authority to make any changes,
Right.
you won't get anywhere. And
Yeah.
so it's better to find like a really healthy, loving way to bless each other and just join a team where they're
Yeah.
going to be innovative. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
No, I agree entirely. I think it's important to go with humility, especially at the beginning when you don't know anything and you think you know stuff. You might have been trained in
You don't
ministry
even
in
know what you don't
America.
know yet.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And these older missionaries, they've been in this country way longer than you have. They have relationships with these people. They have the language. They have the culture.
Yeah.
You learn things about culture that you can never learn in a book. You can't sit in a classroom and learn culture the way you can sitting with people in the culture.
Yeah.
And so you've got to be humble, but there are things, especially if you're a younger person or if you're listening to local people and they keep saying things like, I hear missionaries say that all the time and that's not the way it really is. And you're like, well, why is this guy I'm sitting under not changing his ideas or changing his stances if the local people keep saying that's not right? I think things like that are a good reason to start looking for somebody else to work with. But I also think you need to take some time in it. Sit with that person for
This
a
is not
while.
like a decision you make in your first year. You need to
Yeah,
learn the
yeah,
language, and then after you learn the language, you need to learn from your mentor.
right.
Like, so I'm thinking like this type of tension and dynamic that you're going to work through is probably at year 4, year 5,
Yeah,
maybe. I mean, I'm
yeah,
just out of like context, maybe if someone's
yeah,
listening. It's not like you go your first year learning
right.
language and you're like, oh, I know better.
Yeah,
No, you don't.
yeah. I think it makes sense for younger people who are just trying to find a place to fit if they really aren't sure yet starting out and they're just like trying to figure out who am I even going to start working with for a longer time. Um, but I've seen so many young people just bouncing around and never just sitting for a while and trying to figure it out where they are.
Yeah,
And it's hard it's hard to watch that because you're like you keep having these opinions and ideas about what's right and what's wrong, but you never actually sat and tried it. And so yeah, I
yeah,
think you can see the pride in those people who say I've got all the answers, or they're not doing it the way I want them to do it, and so I'm just going to do something else. Well,
yeah,
you're never going to learn why they're doing it that way, and you're never going to actually learn from those people because obviously they've been here. There's a reason they're doing it this way.
yeah.
So even if you end up not agreeing in a few years and moving, um, I think people need to take time to figure out what's going on before they just
Yeah. Yeah.
you know
Yeah.
shift
I
out.
probably started this conversation on the wrong, like, this is not the right interview timing for this conversation.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No,
Yeah,
it's my fault. It's my fault. I guess someone's listening. We're talking about how you got into missions. You just need to go to the field and learn and spend time learning from people who know way more than you
yeah,
do.
yeah,
And after you've learned the language, you've learned the culture, and you've learned how to do what they do, when this begins to be a thing, you prayerfully do it, like you said, in humility. But
yeah.
this is just after years on the field.
Right,
And
right.
your first years, you're going to go in and you are going to have ideas and opinions, and you're going to be wrong. You don't even know you're
Yeah,
wrong yet, and
yeah,
you just got to go and listen. And there's so much to learn. But this is kind of a different dynamic and level of team down the road that you
yeah,
got to wade through, and it's just got to be in surrender to Jesus and humility, and working that out in tension, and not, man, I don't know,
yeah,
man. This is a big conversation, but
yeah. Yeah, there's so much we can talk about in all of these areas of ministry. One of my biggest regrets, I'd say, when I left Lao was I left thinking I had a lot of answers and that the people I was working with weren't listening to me. And I didn't leave because of that, but I had that chip on my shoulder, and
yeah,
then I was away for a little while and I was like, man, there is a lot more good happening in that ministry and from those leaders than I was willing to talk about because I was so focused on the couple of things that I thought needed to be happening. Uh,
yeah,
so, you know, um, it's really important to me, especially the older I get, to see younger people in ministry being humble and just coming to learn and serve.
Yeah. 100%. I agree. Well, tell me a little bit, like, you got to the field, you were in Laos, you went to Thailand. Where else have you been?
So those are the two places I've spent long term.
Okay.
I was in Ghana for a month, which was the longest
Yeah.
I'd been anywhere before I went to Laos for 9 months. While I was in high school, so as far as ministry goes, I've been to Canada. And then while I was in Southeast Asia, I went to Vietnam with my mentor, who is the guy who invited me to Laos and to Thailand. We did some media stuff there, getting pictures and videos for the ministry Change the Map, and for the missionaries there to get their, their resources and all that stuff. And then I went to Cambodia, not for ministry, but I got to see what the country was like. And that's given me a better idea of the future of what's happening there. And then Nepal. We went to Nepal for 3 weeks for Change the Map to get with the missionaries and the ministries there. There's a guy who's trying to get to Bhutan for the Assemblies of God. So we had some talks with him as well, and then got to see some of the Assemblies of God, Nepali churches and pastors and ministries there. And Nepal is the birthplace of Buddhism, but it's also very strongly Hindu. So it's one of the darkest places I've ever been. And it let me see more of those unreached people who have limited to no access to the gospel, and really the spiritual stronghold that's on their lives and what it's going to take to reach them.
Wow.
It's a lot.
Wow. That's good. That's okay. So what did day to day, what did life look like for you? Did you have enough time to, like, learn the language and do church planting? Or are you doing church planting while you're learning the language? Like, what did your life as a missionary in the field look like?
So this is one of my favorite questions because there isn't an answer.
Okay.
Really, so it was different in Laos than it was in Thailand, especially because I was in Thailand during COVID. But Laos, like I said, is communist, so we had to go undercover as English teachers. So half of my day was taken studying language. So my Lao language got pretty good. And then the other half was prepping for teaching, and then teaching at night for the majority of the weekdays. We could not church plant as foreigners in Laos. So we had local believers working at the school that we were a part of, that we invested in. We did discipleship classes with them, leadership classes with them, gave them resources, that kind of thing. So it really was a partnership. And we did have times where we took, we went as tourists out into these villages in the middle of nowhere, where we're like, hey, we really want to push and get some people sending out here. We're talking about starting schools in some of those places as a way in, and also as a way to get local believers a foothold in places where they want to plant churches. So it really was a partnership there in Laos. And one of the best things about that was I was with students, Lao people, all for hours and hours out of the week, just in the classes, and then I could invite them to my home. And in Thailand, so one thing, talking about going as a new missionary, you're not really planting churches starting out. You're just there to learn and to.
When we say, like, people
serve.
are going out to plant churches, that's a very.
It's
very
the end
goal.
Yeah, it is. So you're there to serve. If there's somebody planting a church, you're there to help them. So I went to learn. I studied language in Thailand. Lao and Thai are very similar, so my switch between Lao and Thai was pretty quick and easy. I started reading and writing Thai very quickly because the script is very similar. But I did most of my work, aside from the studying the language, was working in the office for Change the Map, researching about Buddhist unreached people groups, writing about them, doing social media, So if you go on the Change the Map Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, I've written a lot of those posts and emails that we send out. And then when the country was opened up a little bit more, we traveled around. We got interviews with pastors. We got interviews with missionaries. We went into temples, got videos and photos of temples and monks and Buddhists doing their thing on the holy days. And then as far as the church planting side of things goes, the media team I was a part of, we just helped kind of resource the missionaries, get them videos made, get some graphics done for them. I was kind of more behind the scenes. Josh, the media director, he did most of that work, but I helped him with all that stuff, carried his gear, got some of the background photo and video stuff. And then I got to work in a Thai church. I was on their camera crew. You kind of, you imagine these countries overseas a lot of times, they're churches and villages or whatever, but they had live stream happening at the church I was a part of, the oldest AG church in Thailand. And so I was one of their live stream camera guys, and I worked with their youth group. And my hope was to help train up leaders in that church, and especially out of the youth group. And unfortunately, because of COVID, we didn't get a lot of time to do that kind of stuff before I left the country. And then I came back to America and thought I was going back to Thailand and ended up getting engaged. So I don't even know what it's going to be like for the future. But we'll go overseas and we'll see. Our heart will still be raising up a local believers to plant churches.
Yeah. No, that's good. Well, we'll jump into another video here. We'll talk about some questions on missions and discipleship. Let me ask you this to close out the interview. What is the opportunity? Like if you're sharing with people who are listening, people at church, in church, who maybe they're on the fence with missions right now. Everybody knows we can give, so but I think what would you want people to know about missions and people to consider?
You can do it. Every missionary I've ever met is a normal person. That, you tend to hold missionaries on this pedestal, or you're like, oh man, they have this great calling in their life. And yeah, they've answered a call from God to go to a place that's difficult a lot of times, but anyone can do this. And if you have this idea in your mind, like, man, I really like to do that, I feel like that's God telling you that you're supposed to be doing it. So do it. Any missions organization you can think of has a way to get on the field, and they have opportunities, they have resources. Because I'm the Assemblies of God, I'll tell you, we've got wideopenmissions.org. You can go on there. You can type in what you're looking for, and just tons and tons and tons of opportunities will come up. You can go short term, you can go for a few weeks, a few months, and a couple of years. It's all there. So just do it. Just get in there and do it. And they'll help you. They're not going to just say, okay, we'll figure it out. They'll tell you exactly what you need to do to get on the mission field. So just jump right in and do it. Don't hesitate.
Okay. Awesome. Thanks, Jacob. I'm super excited. Thank you for sharing. And we'll check out some of these next videos. We're going to ask you some questions.
Okay, great.